Look, I am sitting here on Wednesday, May 13, 2026, and the world has officially lost its mind. You are probably expecting me to do some boring breakdown of the latest election results, but I have been in France all week promoting my book, so you are getting the raw truth I recorded just a few days ago. We are standing in a pretty insane situation right now that most people are completely missing because they are too busy doom scrolling. Last week, the US stock market hit a brand new all-time high, and I want you to just sit with that for a second. It is not just the US either, because the Japanese stock market just hit a new global all-time high this morning. For anyone who has not been paying attention, this is the first thing you need to wrap your head around. We are sitting in the middle of a war and a geopolitical disaster, specifically designed to destroy the global economy and collapse living standards. The primary plan right now from global actors is to damage the economy, and we are expecting to see a massive collapse in living standards across the Western world. And yet, despite this intentional destruction of the economy, the global stock markets are the highest they have ever been. Japan and the US are at all-time highs, while the UK FTSE 100 is up 21% in a single year. Spain is up a mind-blowing 32% in 12 months. These are massive one-year moves from a starting point where markets were already at all-time highs a year ago. It is not just stocks, because gold has gone absolutely mental, rising 98.5% in the last 2 years. While silver has jumped 174%, we are sitting in the midst of an enormous economic crisis, and yet every global asset price is doing incredibly well. Most people are confused because they were led to believe the lie that when the economy is good, the stock market goes up, and when the economy is bad, the market goes down. But here we are in the most obvious piece of economic wreckage we have seen in decades, and the stock market is going through the roof. I am going to explain exactly what is happening, and I am going to tell you the truth that the mainstream talking heads are too scared to admit. First of all, this is not new behavior for the system. I am talking to you in 2026 in the middle of a crisis, but 5 years ago we had COVID, which was another massive economic disaster. What was the long-term effect of COVID on your life? Gold and stocks and housing all went through the roof. In 2011, we had the sovereign debt crisis, and in 2008, we had the Lehman shock, and both of those eventually pushed asset prices to the moon. Why is it that every time we have a war or a pandemic or a bank collapse, it ends up pushing asset prices up when common sense says they should go down? A narrative started to form about 10 years ago that tried to explain this by looking at interest rates. Back in 2008, the banks in the Western world lent money to people who could not pay it back, and the whole system almost went bankrupt. The response from the governments and the central banks was to aggressively slash interest rates to effectively 0%. This happened again during COVID, and it became the accepted wisdom that asset prices did well because borrowing money became free. In economic theory, there is supposed to be a tight relationship between what it costs to borrow and what an asset is worth. Think about it this way. If you put $1 million in a savings account at 5% interest, you get $50,000 a year for doing nothing. If you see a rental property that also brings in $50,000 a year in rent, then that house should be worth about $1 million because the returns are the same. But if the bank cuts interest rates to only 1%, your $1 million only earns you $10,000 a year. In that world, a house that still brings in $50,000 a year in rent suddenly becomes worth $5 million because you would need $5 million in the bank to get that same $10,000. That is a simplified version of the math that explains why cutting interest rates makes the rich richer while you get priced out of a home. It makes real assets like land and profitable companies worth so much more relative to the cash in your wallet, which is losing value every day. But then something crazy happened after COVID when inflation spiked and interest rates started rising very quickly. Base rates went from 0 to 5%, and long-term interest rates jumped just as fast. According to the old narrative, this should have caused asset prices to crash because borrowing was no longer free. But instead, asset prices rose even faster, and we are seeing that same dynamic again right now in 2026. The economy is weakening and living standards are falling and interest rates are high, and yet asset prices refuse to come down. What is actually causing this is something that is under-discussed and under-understood by the general public. I am talking about deficits and the distribution of wealth. I have correctly predicted these price increases for the last 6 years because I understand one simple rule about our monetary system. When a government runs a massive deficit, it means they are borrowing or printing money and giving it away, which means somebody has to be accumulating that cash during COVID. The governments ran deficits that were mined. Blowingly big, reaching £20,000 per adult in some countries. My background is in distribution and inequality, and I wanted to know who was actually holding all that new cash on the other side of the government debt. The conclusion was obvious then, and it is obvious now because that money ended up in the hands of the richest people in the world. When you give a billionaire an extra $100 million, they do not go out and buy $100 million worth of cheeseburgers or new shoes. Very rich people are not cash constrained, so when they get an enormous pile of money, they do exactly one thing with it. They buy assets. If someone gives me £100,000 today, I am going to buy £100,000 worth of assets before the sun goes down. This is the established playbook that we have seen repeated in 2008 and 2011 and 2020, and again right now in 2026. The government fixes every crisis by borrowing a ton of money from the rich, and then giving that money right back to the rich through various subsidies and schemes. This massive redistribution of wealth means that every single crisis ends with more money piling up at the top. The consequence is a massive increase in inequality and a massive explosion in the price of stocks and gold and housing. In COVID, the amount of money given to the rich was so large that it even pushed up their consumption, which drove inflation higher. That is why we saw the strange combination of asset prices going up at the same time as interest rates. These things are supposed to move in opposite directions, but the sheer volume of cash being handed to the ultra wealthy broke the traditional model. None of this makes sense until you recognize that we are transferring the wealth of nations into the pockets of a tiny group of people. And you need to understand that asset prices going up is not a good thing for you or your family or your future, unless you are already sitting on a massive pile of shares and property. Rising asset prices are a disaster for the working class. Expensive assets mean you cannot afford a house, and your kids cannot afford a house, and you certainly cannot afford a comfortable pension. You are being squeezed out of financial stability while your government goes deeper into debt to subsidize the people who are pricing you out. We are seeing this globally, where governments are becoming powerless to protect their citizens because they are broke. Stop associating high stock prices with a strong economy, because the last 20 years have proven that a weak economy can create very expensive assets. High house prices and high gold prices are not signs of success. They are the direct symptoms of an extreme inequality that is driving ordinary families into poverty. Your falling living standards are the flip side of the coin that shows the stock market hitting all-time highs. If an economic crisis can be solved by a government running a deficit and giving that money to the rich, then the crisis was always just a problem of distribution. If production and capacity had actually fallen, we would not be able to protect living standards just by moving numbers around on a balance sheet. This realization should actually be a source of positivity, because it means the resources we need to thrive are all still here. The governments are going into debt because they are trying to fix a distributional problem that they refuse to address through fair taxation. Every problem that is currently being fixed by government debt could be solved without increasing inequality if we simply tax the ultra-wealthy. It is just two different ways of managing the resources of a country, and right now we are choosing the way that destroys the middle class. Housing does not need to be unaffordable, and families should not be struggling to turn on the heat, while billionaires pay a lower tax rate than their cleaners. When I see rising asset prices, I see the canary in the coal mine telling us that the rich are getting richer at a rate that is not sustainable. This is 100% fixable if we create a tax system that taxes wealth instead of just taxing work. I have been betting on asset prices going up for a long time, and I have made a lot of money doing it, but that does not mean I think the system is healthy. We are still dealing with every economic problem by transferring resources from the welfare state to the hands of the rich. If you want a stable economy and a future where you can actually own a home, you cannot accept this level of increasing inequality. We need to fight for a system that stops creating billionaires out of national disasters. While the rest of us are left with the bill, send this video to your mom and tell your friends and your family, because we are starting to win the argument. The truth is starting to come out, and once enough people understand the math, the game is over for the people at the top. I drive a 2016 sedan and I drink 50-cent coffee because I know that ownership is the only way out of this trap. Stop being a financial victim of the narrative and start looking at the distribution of the money, because that is where the real story is hidden. We are going to keep fighting for a fair system, and we are going to keep exposing the lies that keep you in the rat race. Good luck out there, because the world is getting more expensive and you need to be smarter than the people who are trying to take your future. I will see you in the next video, where we dive even deeper into the specific ways they are hiding this wealth transfer from the public. Keep your head up and your eyes open, and do not let them convince you that your struggle is a sign of a booming economy. The math does not lie even when the politicians do. Peace.